Everyone knows the legend of the Big Boy, celebrated as the world's largest steam locomotive. But hidden in Union Pacific's shadow, another giant quietly outperformed it where it mattered most. The Challenger 3985 was not just lighter and faster. It was more practical, more versatile, and actually pulled more freight on real routes while costing less to run. Yet almost no one remembers its name. It was forgotten. How could the true workhorse get erased by spectacle and myth? The answer starts with the story we have all been told. In the early 1940s, headlines across the country shouted about a new mechanical marvel, the Union Pacific Big Boy, stretching over 132 feet from coupler to coupler, towered above the tracks at nearly 17 feet high. Newspapers called it the world's largest locomotive, and the phrase stuck. Photographs showed crowds dwarfed by its immense driving wheels, each one taller than the average man. Magazines like Life and Popular Mechanics gave the Big Boy center stage, describing it as the pinnacle of American engineering. Wartime newsreels lingered on its massive boiler, the smoke billowing high above the plains, and the thunder of 16 driving wheels pounding out a rhythm that echoed across the West. The numbers alone were enough to capture the public's imagination. A weight of over 1.2 million pounds, a boiler pressure of 300 pounds per square inch, and the power to haul more than 4,000 tons over the steep grades of Sherman Hill. For most Americans, this was more than a machine. It was proof that the country could build bigger, stronger, and faster than anyone else. Children clipped out pictures for their scrapbooks. Model train companies rushed to produce miniature big boys, and railroad brochures boasted of the mightiest locomotive ever built. The myth only grew as the Big Boy thundered through town after town. Its very presence became a spectacle. Whenever a Big Boy rolled into a station, people gathered just to witness the scale. Farmers, factory workers, and school children all craning their necks for a glimpse. The legend was cemented not only in steel and steam, but in the language of the day: unmatched, unstoppable, the giant of the rails. With every newspaper spread and every wide-eyed crowd, the Big Boy's reputation as the ultimate locomotive grew. In the shadow of this giant, few bothered to ask what made a locomotive truly great, or if the biggest was always the best. Union Pacific's publicity department understood the power of spectacle. They poured resources into promoting the Big Boy, not just as a locomotive, but as a symbol of American strength and progress. Brochures, posters, and newsreels all featured the Big Boy's massive frame, inviting the public to marvel at its size and power. Railroad executives recognized that the image of the world's largest steam engine could draw crowds, boost ticket sales, and inspire confidence in the company's future. Museums and historical societies soon followed the same logic. When it came time to select locomotives for preservation, boards and donors gravitated toward the Big Boy. The promise of higher attendance numbers and donor contributions made the choice almost automatic. A Big Boy on display meant headlines, photo opportunities, and a steady stream of visitors eager to stand beside a record breaker. The sheer physical presence of the Big Boy made it a natural centerpiece for fundraising campaigns and public events. Behind the scenes, Union Pacific's own marketing teams worked closely with museum curators and community leaders. They provided technical support, promotional materials, and even helped coordinate logistics for moving these giants to display sites. Donors, wanting their names associated with the ultimate achievement in steam power, opened their checkbooks to secure a piece of the legend. The Big Boy's reputation as the pinnacle of steam was reinforced with every plaque, every grand opening, and every magazine spread featuring its towering profile. This cycle of attention, funding, and publicity did more than preserve a locomotive. It preserved a narrative. The Big Boy became the face of American railroading, not because it was the most practical or widely used, but because it was the easiest to celebrate. In a world where museum attendance and donor dollars often decide what survives, the myth of the big boy thrived, leaving quieter, less glamorous machines like the Challenger in the shadows. Union Pacific's finance department kept the record straight. From 1936 to 1943, they signed purchase orders for 105 Challenger locomotives. In contrast, only 25 big boys ever rolled out of the Alco plant, all commissioned from 1941 to 1944. That number stands out, 4 Challengers for every big boy. The Challenger's production started well before the big boy's arrival, and continued even after the last big boy was delivered. For 7 years, Union Pacific kept ordering Challengers, year after year, as the backbone of their freight service. When the big boy appeared in 1941, it was a response to a very specific need, not a replacement for the established workhorse. Even during the height of World War II, when railroads faced their greatest test, Union Pacific still placed orders for more Challengers, adding 40 new units in 1943 and 1944. Meanwhile, the big boy order book closed at 25. These numbers were not an accident. Each locomotive represented a major investment, hundreds of thousands of dollars, months of labor, and careful planning. The finance desk did not gamble on unproven machines. They chose what worked. The Challenger's build numbers tell a story that does not match the headlines. If the big boy was truly the best, why did Union Pacific keep coming back for more Challengers? Why did the company's own records show such a clear preference for the smaller, less celebrated design? The answer lies in the railroad's day-to-day reality. The Challenger was everywhere, on main lines, branch lines, mountain passes, and flatlands. The big boy, for all its fame, was a rare sight. The numbers on the books raised questions that could not be answered by publicity alone. They demanded a closer look at how and where these locomotives actually earned their keep. At the heart of Union Pacific's main line, a stretch of railroad known as Sherman Hill tested every locomotive that faced it. Rising west out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, the grade climbed to an elevation of over 8,000 feet, with a ruling incline of 1.55% for more than 40 miles. For railroaders, this was no ordinary hill. Sherman was the bottleneck that could grind wartime supply chains to a crawl. During World War II, the volume of military freight surged beyond anything Union Pacific had ever managed. Trains loaded with tanks, ammunition, and food supplies needed to cross the Rockies without delay. But Sherman Hill's steep climb forced dispatchers to add helper engines to every heavy train, coupling and uncoupling locomotives mid-grade, burning through precious time and crew hours. Chief Mechanical Engineer Otto Jabelman saw the problem firsthand. The existing fleet, Challengers included, struggled to keep up with the relentless demand. Double-heading and even triple-heading became routine, but each additional locomotive added complexity and risk. On a busy day, a single bottleneck train could back up traffic for miles in both directions. The railroad's solution was not just to build bigger engines, it was to build a locomotive that could conquer Sherman Hill alone. That is how the big boy was born. With a starting tractive effort of over 135,000 pounds and 16 driving wheels, it was designed to haul 4,000-ton trains up the 1.55% grade without help. The goal was simple: eliminate the need for extra locomotives, streamline operations, and keep the wartime supply lines moving. Only 25 big boys were ordered, each assigned to the Cheyenne-Laramie run, where the grade was steepest and the stakes highest. For Union Pacific, the big boy was not about breaking records for their own sake. It was an emergency tool, engineered for a crisis that demanded a specialized answer. While the rest of the network relied on versatile workhorses like the Challenger, Sherman Hill's unique challenge called for something different. A locomotive built not for the whole system, but for one relentless stretch of track where failure was not an option. On paper, the big boy's raw numbers are hard to ignore. With a starting tractive effort of 135,375 pounds, it could wrench a fully loaded freight train into motion, where lesser engines would simply slip their wheels. But the real test of a locomotive comes not at the moment of launch, but mile after mile, at speed, with tons of freight behind and a schedule to keep. That is where the Challenger quietly outperformed its famous cousin. Engineers who ran both machines remember the difference. At the throttle of a Challenger, crews could count on a steady pull even as the train picked up speed. The Challenger's 97,350 pounds of starting tractive effort translated to 55,000 to 60,000 pounds of drawbar pull at 35 miles per hour, right in the heart of Union Pacific's typical freight speeds. For a big boy, the tractive effort dropped more sharply as speed increased. Its massive cylinders and long drive rods were tuned for brute force at low speeds. But mechanical losses stacked up fast with every mile per hour gained. By 40 miles per hour, the big boy's advantage had narrowed, and on flat stretches, the Challenger could keep pace or even outpull its heavier stablemate. Veteran engineer Bob Krieger once described the Challenger as the best all-around puller we ever had. He was not alone. Crew logs from the 1940s note that Challengers could maintain their assigned speeds on long grades without overheating or slipping, while the big boy's heavier frame sometimes struggled to keep up the pace on anything but the steepest climbs. The Challenger's lighter weight and more flexible articulation meant less resistance on curves and less stress on the rails, allowing it to deliver more of its power to the train instead of fighting its own bulk. The numbers tell a story that rarely made it into the headlines. In real-world service, where trains spent most of their time rolling at 30 to 40 miles per hour, the Challenger's power curve was almost perfectly matched to the job. It was this sustained, usable pull, not just brute strength at a standstill, that made the Challenger the backbone of Union Pacific's operations. For the men in the cab, it was not the biggest locomotive that mattered most. It was the one that got the work done, trip after trip, without drama. Dispatchers working the Union Pacific Main Line in the 1940s and 50s faced a simple equation. Every extra pound on the rails meant more stress, higher costs, and tighter restrictions. The big boy's 67,500-pound axle load pushed right up against the limits of what most tracks could handle. That figure might seem abstract, but for a dispatcher, it meant the difference between a locomotive that could roam the entire network and one that was confined to reinforced main lines. The Challenger's 63,000-pound axle load kept it under the typical 65,000-pound branch line rating. A narrow margin, but enough to open up hundreds of miles of track that the big boy could not even touch. Fuel bills told another story. Big boys could burn through more than 22,000 pounds of coal per hour at speed, while a Challenger typically used between 16,000 and 18,000 pounds for the same work. Over a year, that translated to a savings of nearly 8 million pounds of coal per locomotive. In 1940s dollars, that was $40,000 to $50,000 saved per engine per year, enough to fund extra crews or keep more locomotives in service. Multiply that across a fleet of over 100 Challengers, and the economic advantage became impossible to ignore. Maintenance foremen kept careful track of downtime. They knew that every day a locomotive sat in the shop was a day it was not earning revenue. The Challenger's simpler design meant shorter inspection cycles, 3 to 4 days for routine service, with only 15 to 20 days out of action each year. The big boy, with its specialized parts and heavier frame, often needed 5 to 7 days for inspection and could spend up to 25 days a year sidelined. Availability rates told the tale. Challengers were ready for duty 85 to 90% of the time, while big boys hovered between 75 and 85%. For a railroad moving critical freight, that gap represented lost opportunity and higher costs. From the dispatcher's desk to the roundhouse floor, the numbers favored the Challenger. it could go where the big boy could not, burn less fuel mile after mile, and spend more time pulling trains instead of waiting for repairs. In the daily arithmetic of railroad economics, practical efficiency mattered more than headline-grabbing power. For Union Pacific, the Challenger was not just a locomotive, it was a business decision that paid off every time it left the yard. In 1981, a group of Union Pacific employees and volunteers gathered in Cheyenne, Wyoming, determined to bring Challenger 3985 back to life. The locomotive had been sidelined for decades, its paint faded and its bearings frozen. But the Heritage Shop crew saw potential where others saw only scrap. Over the next 18 months, they stripped the engine down to bare metal, replaced worn-out parts, and rebuilt the massive running gear piece by piece. The restoration cost Union Pacific $500,000, a substantial investment for a machine that had not turned a wheel in revenue service since 1957. When steam finally filled the cylinders again, 3985 thundered out of the roundhouse and onto the main line, ready for a new chapter. Over the next 3 decades, the Challenger covered more than 100,000 miles in excursion service, pulling passenger trains across the West at speeds up to 70 miles per hour. Crews praised its smooth ride and reliable power, noting how easily it handled long grades and tight curves. Unlike the big boy, which demanded specialized crews and infrastructure, 3985 ran on standard track, stopping in small towns and big cities alike. The locomotive's second life proved that practical engineering could stand the test of time, and that forgotten excellence, once given a chance, could still draw crowds and admiration. 8. Big boys are preserved across the United States, each drawing steady crowds and headlines wherever they rest. By contrast, only 2 Challengers have been saved, number 3977 standing silent in North Platte, and number 3985, the sole survivor to run again in modern times. This imbalance was no accident. When the time came to decide which locomotives would be spared from the torch, museum boards and railroad executives almost always chose spectacle over service. The big boy's towering frame and record-breaking reputation made it the obvious candidate for preservation grants and donor attention. Even though the Challenger had served longer, traveled farther, and proved more versatile, its story faded quietly into the background. In 2020, Union Pacific made a final decision that echoed this pattern. With limited resources, the company retired number 3985 from excursion service, shifting all focus to the newly restored big boy number 4014. The Challenger, once the backbone of the fleet, was sidelined while the legend of the big boy rolled on. The engines that did the most work now stand in the shadows, while the biggest commands the spotlight. Today, the Challenger's legacy sits in storage, while the big boy commands headlines and museum halls. As myths outpace facts, we risk losing sight of what true innovation looks like: quiet, practical, and often overlooked. In a world obsessed with spectacle, the real measure of greatness hides in the details we choose to remember or forget. What stories are we still missing? Share your thoughts below.